The night they locked him inside the mental ward, the temperature outside dropped to -20, and the storm that followed would bury roads, silence radios, and erase entire tracks from existence. But none of that frightened him as much as the sound of steel doors closing behind his back, because a man like him did not fear snow, he feared being unheard, and for the first time in his life, no one believed him. He had stood in war zones where silence meant death, had navigated darkness where one wrong move cost lives, had trusted instinct over orders when everything felt wrong, and every single time, that instinct had saved him, saved others, brought men home who should have been lost forever. But now those same instincts had turned against him in the eyes of everyone else, turned him into something unstable, something dangerous. Something that needed to be contained instead of trusted, and as the doors shut with a heavy metallic finality, he realized something colder than the storm outside was already closing in around him. The white German shepherd had not been allowed inside, had been taken away before they brought him here, pulled back by hands that didn't understand what that bond meant, didn't understand that separating them wasn't just procedure, it was a mistake, the kind of mistake people make when they don't recognize what they're dealing with. And as the dog fought against the leash outside, claws scraping against frozen ground, a low growl buried deep in its chest, he didn't look back, because looking back would have meant accepting the separation, and he refused to accept it. Inside, the air was too still, too controlled, stripped of the harshness of the outside world but also stripped of something else, something real, something alive, and he felt it immediately, the way you feel when something doesn't belong, when the environment itself is wrong, not dangerous in the obvious sense, but wrong in a way that builds slowly, like pressure behind the eyes. The walls were clean, too clean, the lighting soft but unnatural, humming faintly overhead, and the silence wasn't the silence of snow, it was the silence of suppression, of things being held down, contained, ignored, and the people around him moved with routine, not awareness, not instinct, but routine, and that alone told him everything he needed to know. Because routine is what gets people killed when something unexpected enters the equation. They had called him unstable, had written reports filled with words that didn't match reality, words that turned experience into delusion, instinct into paranoia, and warnings into symptoms. But what he had seen out there in the snow had not been imagined, it had not been stress, it had not been the result of trauma-twisting perception, it had been real, something buried beneath the surface. Something that moved where nothing should move, something that had left tracks where no tracks should exist, and the worst part wasn't that he had seen it, the worst part was that it had seen him too. The memory hit him again, sharp and uninvited, the moment when the storm had been building, when visibility dropped to nothing, when sound carried differently through the wind, and the dog had stopped, not out of confusion, not out of hesitation, but out of certainty, body rigid, ears forward, eyes locked on something beneath the snow, and that was the moment everything changed, because the dog never reacted without reason, never stopped without cause, and when it began to dig, not frantically, but deliberately, that was when the first doubt entered his mind, not doubt about the dog, but doubt about everything he had been told about that terrain, because nothing in the briefing had prepared him for what lay beneath. He had tried to explain it, had tried to tell them what they had found, what the dog had uncovered, the structure, the movement, the sound beneath the ice that didn't belong to nature, but the more he spoke, the more their expressions shifted, from attention to concern, from concern to skepticism, and finally to something worse, dismissal, the kind that doesn't come from lack of understanding, but from refusal to accept something outside controlled knowledge, and that was when the decision had been made not by him, but about him. Now he sat in a room that felt smaller than it should, not because of its size, but because of its purpose, because it was designed to contain, not just bodies, but ideas, to keep things quiet, to keep things controlled, and the longer he stayed there, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about his mental state, this was about silencing what he had seen, what he knew, what he was trying to say before anyone else had a chance to listen. Outside, the storm grew stronger. Wind slamming against reinforced windows, snow building against the structure like something trying to bury it completely, and somewhere out there, beyond the reach of their control, beyond the walls and the lights and the false sense of safety, The white German shepherd was still moving, still searching, still following the instinct that had never once been wrong. Inside, they told him to rest. Told him to stop thinking about it. Told him it wasn't real. But the problem wasn't what he remembered. The problem was what he couldn't forget. Because something was still out there in the storm. And it hadn't stopped moving. The storm outside did not just grow, it consumed everything in slow, relentless layers, burying roads, swallowing sound, bending trees under its weight. But inside the facility, none of that seemed to matter, because the walls were built to ignore nature, to suppress it, to keep everything controlled and predictable, and that was exactly what made him uneasy, because real danger never announces itself in controlled environments. It hides beneath them, waiting for the moment when control slips. Just enough to reveal what was always there. He sat on the narrow bed, hands resting loosely but his mind moving with sharp precision, replaying every second from that night in the snow, not out of obsession, but out of necessity. Because when something doesn't make sense, you don't ignore it, you dissect it, piece by piece, until the truth reveals itself, and the truth in this case was simple: something had been under that snow, something that did not belong. Something that reacted to presence, and something that had followed them longer than anyone realized. The white German shepherd had known it before he did, that much was clear now, because instinct operates faster than logic, and when the dog had stopped in the storm, when its entire body had shifted from movement to stillness, it had not been confusion, it had been recognition, and recognition means familiarity, which means this was not the first time it had sensed something like that. And that thought alone tightened something in his chest, because it meant whatever they had encountered was not new, not isolated, not accidental. It had existed before that night, maybe longer than anyone had recorded. He could still see the way the dog's paws had moved, controlled, precise, digging through layers of hardened snow as if it knew exactly where to go, not searching randomly, not reacting emotionally, but working towards something specific. And when the ice finally cracked beneath it, when the surface gave way just enough to reveal the darkness below, that was when the storm had stopped feeling like the biggest threat. He remembered the sound more than anything, not loud, not violent, but wrong, a deep, muffled shift beneath the ground, like something adjusting its position, like something aware of being uncovered, and that was when his instincts had aligned completely with the dog's, not because he understood what it was, but because he understood what it wasn't, and it wasn't natural. He had tried to mark the location, had tried to communicate what they found, but the signal had broken, cut off in a way that didn't match storm interference, too clean, too precise, and even then, even in that moment, a part of him had recognized the pattern, because communication doesn't just disappear like that without cause. Inside the facility, time moved differently, slower, heavier, stretched between moments that felt too quiet, too empty, and the people around him spoke in calm tones, used careful language, avoided direct confrontation with what he was saying, and that avoidance told him more than any denial could, because people who know nothing argue, people who know something avoid. They asked questions, but not the right ones, not the ones that would lead to understanding, but the ones that would confirm their own conclusions, and every answer he gave seemed to push him further into the category they had already placed him in: unstable, unreliable, compromised, and that word, compromised, echoed louder than anything else, because compromise implies interference, implies influence, implies something affecting perception, and the more he thought about it, the more that word felt like a reflection of something deeper, not him, but the situation itself. The lights above flickered once, barely noticeable, just a subtle shift in brightness, but it caught his attention instantly, because controlled environments don't flicker without reason, and when they do, it means something has disrupted the system, something small, maybe insignificant, but still outside expected parameters, and that was enough to shift his focus completely from memory to present. He stood slowly, moving toward the small reinforced window, looking out into the storm, watching the way the snow moved against the glass, the way the wind carved patterns that seemed random but weren't, because nothing in nature is truly random, it follows forces, pressure, direction, and those patterns told him one thing clearly: something was moving through it. At first it was nothing, just shifting white against white, the kind of illusion that plays tricks on tired eyes. But his eyes weren't tired, they were trained, calibrated through years of reading terrain, movement, absence of movement, and that's what he focused on, not what he could see, but what was missing, the disruption in the flow of snow, the slight break in pattern, the fraction of a second where wind did not behave the way it should. And then he saw it, not clearly, not fully, but enough, a shape, low, moving against the storm instead of with it, cutting through the wind in a way that only something driven by purpose can. His breath slowed, not out of fear, but out of focus, because the moment stretched, narrowed, intensified, and he leaned slightly closer to the glass, ignoring the cold radiating from it, because what he was seeing mattered more than comfort, more than safety, more than anything inside those walls. The shape moved again, closer this time, more defined, and then it stopped, just beyond the outer perimeter lights, where shadow and snow blurred together, and for a second it disappeared completely, swallowed by the storm, and then it stepped forward into the faint glow. White fur, eyes. The German shepherd. The impact hit harder than any physical force, because it shattered everything they had told him, everything they had tried to make him believe, because the dog was not supposed to be there, not in this storm, not at this distance, not after being taken away, but it was, standing just beyond the perimeter, looking directly toward the building, not searching, not confused, but focused, locked onto a single point. And that point was him. The connection was instant, unspoken but absolute, the same connection they had built through years of training, through missions where trust meant survival, and the moment their eyes aligned through that glass, everything else faded, the room, the walls, the people who thought they understood the situation, because the dog had found him, not by chance, not by wandering, but by tracking something deeper, something tied to that night, to that location, to whatever had been uncovered beneath the snow. Behind him, footsteps approached, slow, controlled, unaware of what was happening just beyond the glass, unaware that the one thing they had removed from the equation had just returned, and the seal didn't turn around, didn't react outwardly, because reacting would draw attention, and attention now was the last thing he needed, because this moment, this connection, this proof, was fragile, and once it was exposed, it would be controlled like everything else. Outside, the dog moved again, stepping closer to the perimeter fence, snow whipping around its body, but its focus never breaking, never shifting, and then it lowered its head slightly, not in submission, but in recognition, and began to dig. Not randomly. Not instinctively. But deliberately. At the edge of the facility. At the exact place where the snow had begun to shift. And in that moment, something inside the seal went completely still. Because the dog wasn't just trying to reach him. It was trying to show him something. Something beneath the facility. Something they had built over. Something that had never stopped moving since the night and the storm. And whatever it was directly under them. The moment the dog's paws struck the frozen ground outside the facility and began digging with that same controlled precision he had seen in the storm, something inside the retired seal locked into place, not panic, not confusion, but recognition, the kind that bypasses doubt completely, because patterns don't lie, and this was the exact same behavior, the exact same focus. The exact same silent certainty that had led them to the impossible beneath the snow that night, and now it was happening. Again, in a different place, under different circumstances, but with the same urgency, the same message: something is here, something is wrong, something is buried where it should not be. He didn't move at first, not physically, because movement would draw attention, and attention inside this place meant control, containment, interference. But his mind moved faster than ever, reconstructing the terrain, the facility's position, the depth of foundation, the way structures like this are built in extreme environments, elevated, reinforced, insulated, and then it aligned with a chilling clarity. If the dog was digging at the perimeter, not randomly, not searching for him directly, but at a specific point along the outer edge, then it wasn't trying to reach the building, it was trying to expose something beneath it. Something connected to the ground itself, something that extended further than the visible structure above. Behind him, the footsteps came closer, steady, measured, belonging to someone who believed everything was under control, someone who had no idea that control had already begun to slip, and the seal slowly stepped back from the window, not breaking eye contact with the dog until the last possible second, because that connection had already delivered what it needed to deliver, the confirmation that he wasn't wrong. That the memory wasn't distorted, that what he had seen in the storm existed. Beyond that single moment, beyond that location, beyond what anyone inside this facility was willing to acknowledge. He turned just as the door opened, the soft mechanical click echoing louder than it should in a place this quiet, and the man who entered carried that same expression he had seen before, calm, composed, professional, the kind of expression built to reassure, to stabilize, to guide conversations away from uncomfortable truths and back into controlled narratives. They spoke in low tones, careful tones, asking questions that circled the same conclusions, repeating phrases about stress, about trauma, about misinterpretation of sensory input in extreme conditions, and the seal listened without reacting, without arguing, because arguing would only reinforce their position, would only give them more reason to tighten control, and right now control was the problem, not the solution. He responded when necessary, but his answers shifted slightly, not changing the truth, but altering how it was delivered, holding back certain details, observing their reactions, testing boundaries, because information, like movement, needed to be controlled, not released all at once, especially in a place where every word could be used to define him. Outside, the dog continued digging. He knew it without seeing it, because he could feel it, not physically, but instinctively, the same way you feel a shift in terrain before you step on it, the same way you sense movement in darkness without sound, and that connection, that silent understanding between them, grew stronger with every second, because the dog was not just reacting to something below, it was communicating, not with sound. Not with behavior that others would recognize, but with consistency, with repetition, with purpose. The conversation in the room shifted slightly, the tone becoming firmer, less open, more directive, suggesting rest, suggesting medication, suggesting that clarity would come with time, and that suggestion alone told him everything he needed to know, because clarity was exactly what they didn't want, not if it led back to the truth beneath the snow. He nodded once, calmly, giving them the response they expected, the compliance they needed to maintain their sense of control, and that was when the shift happened, subtle, almost invisible, but critical, because the moment they believed he had settled, believed he had accepted their version of events, they relaxed, just enough, just for a second, and in environments like this, a second is all it takes. The lights flickered again. This time slightly longer. Just enough for the room to dim, for shadows to stretch unnaturally along the walls, for the hum overhead to shift in pitch, not loud, not alarming, but different, and the seal's attention snapped instantly to that change, because systems like this are built with redundancy, with stability, with safeguards against failure, and when they flicker, when they shift, it means something has interfered. Something has reached into that controlled system and disrupted it, even if only for a moment. Outside, the dog stopped digging. The timing was too precise to ignore. The flicker. The stop. The silence that followed. Everything aligned in a way that made the seal's pulse slow instead of rise, because this wasn't chaos, this wasn't random failure, this was cause and effect, action and reaction, something beneath the facility responding to disturbance above it, or something above reacting to what was being uncovered below. The man in the room noticed the flicker too, but his reaction was different, less instinctive, more procedural, glancing up briefly, then dismissing it with a calm explanation about temporary power fluctuation, backup systems, nothing to be concerned about, and that dismissal confirmed what the seal already suspected. They didn't know, not fully, or if they did, they were not expecting this level of interference. Not expecting the system itself to respond. A distant sound followed. Not from the room. Not from the corridor. From below. Faint. Metallic. A slow, dragging vibration that traveled through the structure rather than the air, felt more than heard, like something shifting against reinforced boundaries, something testing them, something aware. The seal didn't react outwardly. Didn't move. Didn't speak. But inside, everything sharpened to a single point. Because now it wasn't just memory. It wasn't just instinct. It wasn't just the dog confirming what he already knew. Now the facility itself was reacting. And that meant one thing. Whatever was beneath them was awake. And it knew it had been found again. The vibration didn't stop after that first slow metallic shift. It deepened, spreading through the structure in a way that was almost too subtle for anyone without trained awareness to notice. But to him it was unmistakable, a living pulse hidden beneath engineered silence, something pressing against containment not with force, but with persistence, like it had done this before, like it had learned patience over time. And that realization settled into him with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with the storm outside. He remained still, seated again as if nothing had changed, as if the calm exterior they expected from him was real, but his mind had already moved ahead, mapping out possibilities, connecting fragments from that night in the snow with what he was feeling now beneath his boots, because the pattern was repeating, not identical, but close enough to confirm that what they had found out there was not isolated. It was part of something larger, something that extended beyond a single location, beyond a single encounter. The man across from him continued speaking, voice steady, controlled, using the same careful phrasing designed to redirect focus, to keep the conversation anchored in psychological explanations instead of physical ones, but now those words felt hollow, disconnected from reality in a way that made them almost irrelevant, because while they spoke about perception, about stress responses, about misinterpretation of environmental stimuli, the building itself was contradicting them in real time. The subtle tremor beneath the floor, the irregular hum in the walls, the faint shift in lighting that no longer followed a stable rhythm. The seal let him talk, let him fill the space with controlled language, because silence from him created comfort for them, and comfort meant lowered awareness, and lowered awareness created openings. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault, wind driving snow against reinforced glass, visibility reduced to almost nothing, but he didn't need to see clearly to know the dog was still there, because that connection had not broken, not when they separated him, not when they tried to isolate him, not even now, buried beneath layers of controlled environment, and that was the part they had underestimated. They had treated the dog as an asset, a tool, something that could be removed from the equation, but it was never just that. It was instinct, awareness, something that operated beyond the limits of human reasoning, and now it was acting again, not randomly, not emotionally, but with direction. The vibration beneath the floor intensified slightly, just enough to shift the balance of objects resting on surfaces, just enough for a faint sound to travel through the metal structure, a low resonance that should not exist in a stable environment, and the man across from him paused mid-sentence, only for a fraction of a second. But that fraction was enough, because it revealed something unspoken, uncertainty, not full awareness, but enough to recognize that something was off, and in that moment, the seal understood something critical. They did not fully control what was beneath them. They believed they did. They had built systems around it, containment, monitoring, suppression, but control is not the same as understanding, and whatever existed below had reached a point where it was no longer responding passively. The lights flickered again, longer this time, dipping low enough to cast the room into shadow before stabilizing again, and the hum shifted with it, no longer a steady tone but layered with something uneven, something that pulsed irregularly, and that irregularity felt like movement, like adjustment, like something pushing against its limits in a controlled but persistent way. The man stood now, no longer seated, his composure still intact but thinner, his eyes scanning the room briefly before settling back, and he excused himself with a calm explanation, something about checking system stability, nothing unusual, nothing to be concerned about, but his pace toward the door was just slightly faster than before, just enough to confirm that the situation was no longer entirely predictable. The door closed behind him, and the room fell into a deeper silence, one not filled with conversation, but with awareness, and the seal stood slowly, moving back toward the window, ignoring the cold that radiated from it, because what he needed now was confirmation, not from inside, but from outside, from the one presence he trusted more than anything in this moment. The storm still raged, but there, just beyond the perimeter lights, he saw movement again, the white German shepherd shifting position, no longer digging at the same spot, but pacing slightly, as if recalculating, as if adjusting based on new input, and then it stopped again, head turning, ears forward, body rigid, focused not just on the ground now, but on the structure itself. It stepped back. Then forward again. And then it began digging again. But not where it had before. Closer. Directly beneath the facility wall. The precision of that movement sent a sharp realization through him, because that meant whatever was beneath had shifted, had moved, had changed position in response to something, and the dog had tracked that movement, had adjusted its own position accordingly, and that level of responsiveness confirmed something deeper. This wasn't a static presence beneath the ice, it was dynamic, adaptive, aware of its surroundings in ways that extended beyond simple reaction. The vibration beneath the floor responded again. Stronger now. A low, sustained pressure that traveled upward through the structure, subtle but undeniable, and for a moment the seal felt it in his chest more than his feet, a resonance that did not belong to machinery, because machinery follows consistent patterns, even in failure, but this did not. This shifted, changed, adjusted, like something testing boundaries, mapping resistance, learning. A distant alarm sounded faintly somewhere deeper in the facility, not loud, not immediate, but present, the kind of alert designed for internal systems, not external threats, and that told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't just a surface issue, this was coming from below, from the very thing they had tried to contain. Footsteps in the corridor multiplied. Voices, low and urgent, moving quickly now, no longer calm, no longer controlled, and the shift in energy was immediate, because when routine breaks, everything else follows, and now the facility was moving, reacting, adjusting to something it could no longer ignore. The seal stepped back from the window again, positioning himself where he could observe without being immediately visible, because now visibility mattered, now attention mattered, and what he did next would determine everything, because staying here meant containment, meant isolation, meant losing the only connection he had to the truth outside, but moving without understanding the structure, the exits, the patterns, would be just as dangerous. He closed his eyes for a second, not in hesitation, but in focus, replaying everything again, the layout, the entry points, the corridor movement, the timing of the lights, the rhythm of the vibration, because in chaos, patterns still exist, and finding them is the only way through. Outside, the dog stopped digging again, lifted its head, and looked directly at the wall. Then, slowly, it stepped back, as if whatever was beneath had come closer than before. And inside the facility, directly under where he stood, the vibrations surged once more. Not subtle now, not hidden, but real, and rising. And for the first time since they brought him here, the seal realized something with absolute certainty. This place was not designed to keep him inside. It was designed to keep something else from getting out. And whatever it was getting closer to breaking through. Next part, a minimum of 9,000 characters. Part 5. The next surge didn't feel like a vibration anymore. It felt like pressure, like the entire structure had inhaled and was holding its breath. And for a brief second everything inside the facility paused, not by design, not by protocol, but by something deeper, something instinctive, the kind of pause that comes just before something breaks. The lights dimmed again, longer this time, stretching the shadows across the walls until they no longer matched the objects casting them, until angles shifted just enough to feel wrong, and the hum in the ceiling fractured into uneven layers, rising and falling without rhythm, like a system trying to stabilize something it couldn't fully control. The seal remained still, but every sense sharpened to its highest point, tracking every sound, every shift in air pressure, every subtle change in the structure around him, because what was happening now wasn't hidden anymore. It had moved past subtlety, past concealment, into something that demanded response. The corridor outside erupted into motion, not chaotic, but urgent, controlled urgency, the kind that comes from trained personnel reacting to something they don't fully understand but have protocols for. Voices low but fast, footsteps overlapping, equipment being moved, doors opening and closing in quick succession. And that told him two things immediately: they had systems in place for this. and whatever was happening had reached a level that triggered those systems. He moved toward the door, not rushing, not hesitating, but calculating, because timing mattered now more than anything, and stepping into that corridor too early would draw attention, too late would mean losing the opportunity entirely. Outside the reinforced window, the white German shepherd had stopped moving again, standing completely still despite the storm tearing across its body, snow clinging to its fur, wind pushing against it from every direction, but it didn't shift, didn't break its stance, because its focus had narrowed to a single point beneath the ground, and that kind of stillness was never passive, it was preparation. The seal watched it for a fraction longer, just enough to confirm what he already knew. The dog was not reacting to the facility anymore, it was reacting to something directly below it, something that had moved closer to the surface, something that was no longer contained in the same way it had been before. A sharp metallic crack echoed faintly from somewhere deep below, not loud, but distinct enough to cut through the layered noise of the facility, and that sound carried meaning, because metal doesn't crack under normal conditions without force, without pressure exceeding design limits, and the fact that it came from below confirmed what the vibration had already suggested. Whatever was down there was no longer just shifting, it was pushing. The seal stepped back from the window and moved toward the door just as it opened again, faster this time, less controlled, and the person who entered was no longer calm, no longer composed in the same way, the edges of that control frayed just enough to expose urgency underneath. Instructions came quickly, not directed at him specifically, but spoken into a device, orders being relayed deeper into the structure, references to containment levels, to lower sectors, to pressure thresholds, and those words alone were enough to map out a rough structure in his mind. This facility was layered, segmented, built with multiple levels of control, and whatever was happening was centered below. Beneath all of it, at the deepest point where containment would be strongest, and if that containment was failing, then everything above it was already at risk. He moved when the moment opened. Not dramatically. Not in a way that drew immediate attention. Just a step. Then another. Positioning himself closer to the corridor as the focus of everyone else shifted away from him and toward the deeper levels. Because in situations like this, priorities change fast, and right now he was no longer the priority. Whatever was happening below had overtaken everything else. The corridor was colder than before, not by temperature alone, but by atmosphere, because the controlled stillness had been replaced by movement, by urgency, by something real pushing through the layers of protocol, and as he stepped into it, the sound of the facility changed around him, no longer quiet, no longer suppressed, but alive with activity, doors opening ahead, people moving quickly past, no one stopping. No one questioning his presence in that moment, because attention had shifted. Entirely. He followed the flow. Not blindly. Not passively. But with intent, matching pace, matching direction, moving with the current instead of against it, because resistance would stand out, but alignment made him invisible. The deeper they moved into the facility, the more the environment changed, lighting dimmer, walls thicker, frost forming in places where it shouldn't, where insulation should prevent it, and that detail caught his attention immediately, because frost inside a controlled structure means temperature instability, means something affecting the internal environment from a source that was not designed to be exposed. Another vibration hit. Stronger. This time enough to shift his balance slightly, just enough to confirm that whatever was below was no longer testing, it was escalating. A door ahead opened, revealing a larger chamber, not empty, but filled with equipment, monitoring systems, displays flickering with data that changed too fast to read clearly in passing, and beyond that, a reinforced barrier, thick, layered, designed to withstand pressure from one direction, and that direction was below. He slowed slightly, just enough to take it in, because this was closer to the center, closer to where everything converged, and the people around him moved with more intensity now, voices sharper, commands more direct, references to pressure spikes, structural stress, and containment integrity, and that last phrase repeated more than once, because when something like that begins to fail, it becomes the only thing that matters. The SEAL's eyes moved across the room, mapping exits, positions, weaknesses, Because instinct doesn't shut off in environments like this, it adapts, and every detail mattered now, not just for survival, but for understanding what they were dealing with. Another sound came from below. Not metallic this time. Something deeper. Something heavier. A slow, grinding shift that felt less like machinery and more like movement. And then it stopped. Completely. No vibration. No hum. No sound. Just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't bring relief. The kind that warns. Because when something building pressure suddenly stops, it doesn't mean it's over. It means it's about to change. And outside, beyond layers of reinforced walls and buried systems, the white German shepherd stepped back one more time from the ground it had been digging, and let out a low, controlled growl into the storm. Not in fear. Not in confusion. But in warning. Because whatever was beneath them had reached the point where it no longer needed to push. It was about to break through. The silence didn't last long enough to bring relief, only long enough to sharpen every instinct in the room into something tight and focused, the kind of silence that stretches just before impact. And when the next movement came, it wasn't a vibration anymore, it was a shift, a deep, grinding displacement that traveled upward through the structure like something heavy repositioning itself directly beneath their feet. And the entire chamber reacted to it at once, lights flickering hard, screens glitching, a low alarm beginning to pulse somewhere behind the walls, not loud enough to cause panic, but steady enough to signal that whatever threshold they had been monitoring had just been crossed. The personnel around him moved faster now, no longer measured, no longer controlled in the same way, because control had begun to slip into response, and response is always reactive, always one step behind whatever is causing it, and that meant whatever was below had already moved ahead of them. The SEAL didn't rush forward or step back, he stayed exactly where he was for a moment, letting the environment reveal itself, letting the reactions of the people around him expose what mattered most, because in situations like this, people reveal their priorities through movement, through what they protect, what they move toward, what they abandon, and what they avoid. Several of them shifted toward the central barrier, checking readings, adjusting controls, reinforcing whatever systems they believed would hold, while others moved towards secondary stations, securing data, locking down access points, and that division alone told him everything he needed to know. Some of them believed the barrier would hold, others were preparing for what would happen if it didn't. Another shift came from below, stronger, more direct, and this time it carried a sound that didn't belong to metal, a deep, dragging pressure that felt organic in its irregularity, something that didn't follow the clean, predictable patterns of machinery, something that moved with intent instead of design, and the SEAL felt it not just through his feet, but through his chest again, that same resonance. That same unnatural alignment that he had felt out in the snow when the dog first began digging, and that connection snapped into place completely now. This was the same presence, the same force, only now it was closer, contained but no longer passive, aware but no longer hidden. The barrier ahead of them groaned slightly, not visibly cracking, not failing outright, but shifting under pressure in a way that it was never meant to, because reinforced structures are built to resist force, not adapt to it. And whatever was pushing from below wasn't just applying pressure, it was adjusting, probing, testing different points along the surface, and that level of interaction changed everything. Because pressure alone can be resisted, but adaptation finds weaknesses. A voice cut through the room, sharper now, calling out numbers, readings, levels that climbed faster than expected, referencing containment integrity again, but this time the tone was different, no longer confident, no longer assured, but strained, and that strain spread quickly through the room, because uncertainty in leadership translates instantly to everyone else, and now the system wasn't just under stress. The people managing it were too. The SEAL moved then. Not toward the barrier. Not toward the center of activity. But slightly to the side, positioning himself where he could see both the main chamber and the access corridors leading deeper, because instinct told him something critical. If this barrier failed, the immediate reaction would not be controlled evacuation, it would be containment lockdown, sealing sections, isolating areas, trapping anything within specific zones. And being in the wrong place when that happened would mean being locked in with whatever came through. Another sound came. Louder this time. A sharp crack that echoed through the structure, followed by a ripple of movement across the floor, subtle but undeniable, like something pressing upward in multiple points at once, and the displays nearest the barrier flickered violently, data streams breaking apart, reforming, then failing entirely, replaced by static patterns that meant nothing to anyone relying on them. And then the barrier shifted again. Not inward. Not outward. But slightly, uneven. As if the pressure beneath it wasn't centralized. As if it was spreading. The realization hit instantly, because that meant whatever was below was not confined to a single point, it was moving across a wider area, mapping the structure from beneath, finding the path of least resistance. And that changed the entire scenario, because now failure wouldn't be localized, it could happen anywhere along the base. Outside, beyond all of it, the white German shepherd had stopped growling. The seal didn't see it, but he felt the change, because silence from the dog didn't mean safety, it meant focus, it meant decision, and when the dog made that shift, it always meant one thing: it had chosen a direction, a path, an action. Inside the facility, the alarms rose another level, louder now, more urgent, lights shifting from neutral tones to harsh warning colors, bathing the chamber in sharp, uneven illumination that made everything feel more immediate, more unstable, and the personnel began to move differently, no longer maintaining positions, but repositioning, adjusting, preparing for something they could no longer prevent, only respond to. The SEAL's eyes moved again across the structure, across the corridors, across the people, across the barrier that was no longer holding the way it was designed to, and then he saw it, not on the displays, not in the data, but in the structure itself, a faint line forming along one section of the reinforced base, not a full crack, not a break, but a stress point, a place where the pressure had found weakness, where the material had begun to separate just enough to reveal the beginning of failure. He didn't wait. Because waiting in that moment would mean reacting instead of acting. And acting first is the only advantage that matters. He turned toward the nearest side corridor, moving quickly now but not running, maintaining control, because controlled movement draws less attention than panic, and panic was beginning to spread behind him anyway, voices rising, commands overlapping, systems failing to respond the way they should. Another crack. Louder. Closer. And this time, it didn't stop at sound. The floor shifted. Not enough to collapse, but enough to break the illusion of stability completely. And behind him, someone shouted something he didn't need to hear to understand. Containment breach. Partial. Unstable. The words didn't matter as much as the tone. Because tone carries truth faster than language. And the truth was simple. They had lost control. Outside, in the storm, the white German shepherd lunged forward into the snow again, not digging now, not searching, but moving with urgency along the edge of the facility, tracking the shift beneath the ground as it spread, because the thing below was no longer stationary. It was moving. And inside, as the seal reached the corridor and turned into it, the structure behind him let out a deep, tearing sound that did not belong to anything built by human hands. Not a clean break. Not a mechanical failure. But something else. Something forcing its way through. And for the first time since this began, the seal didn't think about proving he was right. He thought about survival. Because whatever was coming through that barrier was not meant to be contained. And it was no longer alone beneath them. The corridor swallowed the noise behind him at first, not completely, but enough to distort it, turning sharp alarms and shouted commands into muffled echoes that bounced unevenly along the narrow walls, and that distortion made it harder to track what was happening behind, but easier to focus on what mattered ahead, because in confined environments like this, survival isn't about knowing everything, it's about knowing just enough. And acting before the situation collapses completely. The seal moved with controlled speed, not sprinting, not hesitating, every step placed with intention, because the structure beneath him was no longer stable, and instability in a place built this deep doesn't fail gradually, it fails suddenly, in sections, in collapses that don't give warning twice. The air in the corridor felt different now, colder in a way that didn't match the climate control systems, a sharpness that cut through the filtered atmosphere, and that change told him something had already breached deeper levels, because temperature shifts like that don't travel upward without a source, and the source was below, moving, expanding, pushing through layers that were never meant to be exposed. He reached a junction and slowed just enough to choose direction, not randomly, not guessing, but reading the signs, the slight slope of the floor, the faint draft in the air, the way frost had begun forming more heavily along one side of the corridor than the other, because cold flows, it follows openings, and openings lead to either escape or collapse, and right now those two possibilities were dangerously close to being the same thing. Behind him, another deep impact rolled through the structure, stronger than before, followed by a cascade of smaller fractures, the sound of reinforced material giving way in sections, not entirely, not yet, but enough to confirm that containment was no longer intact, and the alarms shifted again, louder, more chaotic now, overlapping signals that indicated multiple failures, multiple points of compromise. And that level of breakdown meant one thing clearly: whatever was below was no longer contained to a single breach, it had spread, found multiple paths, and was using them. He turned left. Not because it looked safer, but because it felt less compromised. And in environments like this, feeling is often the only advantage you have when visibility is limited and information is incomplete. The lights flickered again, harder this time, plunging the corridor into near darkness for a split second before returning, and in that split second, something changed, not just visually, but in the way the space felt, like the air itself had shifted, like something had moved closer without making a sound, and the seal's pace didn't slow, but his awareness sharpened further. Because that kind of shift doesn't come from structural failure alone, it comes from presence. Outside, the storm howled louder, wind tearing across the surface with violent intensity, but beneath that chaos, the white German shepherd moved with absolute precision, tracking something that no human eye could see clearly, but that it felt completely, the movement beneath the snow now faster, less controlled, spreading in patterns that mirrored what was happening inside the facility. Because whatever had broken through was no longer contained to a single direction, it was branching, adapting, extending. The dog stopped abruptly again. Not in hesitation, but in confirmation. Its body lowered slightly, muscles tightening, ears locked forward, eyes focused on a point just ahead of the facility's outer edge, and then it moved again, not backward, not away, but sideways, adjusting position to stay aligned with whatever was moving beneath, because alignment mattered, because staying connected to that movement was the only way to understand it, to anticipate it, to respond before it surfaced. Inside, the seal reached another section of corridor where the walls showed visible signs of stress, hairline fractures running along the seams, frost forming thicker here, spreading outward from those cracks like veins, and that detail told him something critical. The pressure from below wasn't just breaking through barriers, it was affecting the entire structural grid, weakening it from beneath in ways that no surface-level reinforcement could counter. A distant figure appeared ahead, moving fast in the opposite direction, one of the personnel, face tense, eyes wide with something that had moved past professional control into something closer to fear, and when their eyes met for a fraction of a second, the seal saw it clearly, not confusion, not uncertainty, but realization, the kind that comes too late to prevent anything, only to react. They passed each other without words. Because words weren't needed. The situation had moved beyond explanation. Another sound rolled through the structure, different this time, not a crack, not a fracture, but a deep, hollow shift, like something had found space where there should be none, like a void opening beneath layers that had always been solid, and that kind of sound carries only one meaning in places like this. Collapse. Partial. But spreading. The seal adjusted direction again, moving toward what he now recognized as an upward incline, slight but consistent, leading away from the deepest sections, because depth is danger when something is rising from below, and distance from that source was the only advantage left. Behind him, the corridor he had just moved through shuddered once, then again, and then part of it gave way, not completely, but enough to drop sections of the floor downward into darkness, the edges cracking, breaking, separating, and the sound that followed was not just structural, it carried something else with it, something that moved through that opening before the debris settled. Something alive. The seal didn't look back. Because looking back doesn't change what's coming. It only delays what you need to do next. Outside, the dog began moving again, faster now, tracking the shift as it moved closer to the surface, closer to breaking through completely, and the snow above it trembled slightly, not from the wind, but from something pushing upward beneath it, something that no longer cared about remaining hidden. Inside, the incline grew steeper. The air colder. The lights more unstable. And ahead, faintly, he could see it. An exit point. Not fully open. But reachable. And in that moment, the seal understood something with absolute clarity. This was no longer about proving anything. Not about the facility. Not about what they believed. Not even about what was beneath them. This was about getting out before whatever was rising from below reached the same level. Because when it did, there would be no more corridors. No more barriers. No more control. Only survival. And outside, in the storm, the white German shepherd dug once more at the exact point where the ground had begun to shift upward. Because it knew, before anyone else, that whatever was coming was about to break through the surface. The incline ahead narrowed as it rose, the corridor tightening just enough to slow movement if he wasn't careful, and in a situation where every second mattered, even the smallest delay could become the difference between reaching the surface or being caught beneath it. But the seal didn't hesitate, he adjusted, shifting his weight forward, using momentum instead of speed, because speed on unstable ground creates mistakes. And mistakes here would not be forgiven. The air grew colder with every step, no longer the artificial cold of controlled systems, but raw, unfiltered cold bleeding in from outside, and that change carried meaning, because it meant the structure above was still intact, at least partially, and that meant there was still a path out. Behind him, the collapse continued to spread. Not in one catastrophic break, but in sections, controlled failure turning into uncontrolled destruction as pressure from below found new weak points. And each time the structure shifted, each time the floor trembled beneath him, the sound that followed carried more than just breaking material, it carried movement, something passing through those fractures, something rising through layers that were no longer able to contain it. The seal reached the final stretch of the incline and stopped for a fraction of a second, not to rest, not to hesitate, but to listen, because sound travels differently in spaces like this, and listening gives you information that sight cannot, especially when visibility is limited and the environment is unstable. The alarms behind him had changed again, no longer steady, no longer structured, but fragmented, overlapping signals that indicated system-wide failure, and beneath those alarms, deeper, quieter, he heard it. Movement. Closer now. Not distant. Not buried. But near. The kind of near that shortens time. The kind that forces decisions. He moved again. Faster now. Not reckless. But committed. The corridor ended in a reinforced hatch, partially sealed by frost, edges stiff from exposure, but not completely frozen, not completely immovable, and that was enough. He reached it and dropped into a lower stance, bracing himself against the wall, hands gripping the mechanism, testing resistance, calculating force, because opening a hatch like this under pressure is not about strength alone, it's about timing, about applying force at the right moment, when the material is weakest, when the pressure from inside and outside aligns just enough to give way. Behind him, another shift rolled through the structure, stronger than anything before it, and this time it carried a sound that froze something deep inside him, not fear, not panic, but recognition. A low, sustained movement. Not scraping. Not cracking. But sliding. As if something massive had found space to move freely. And that meant the containment below had not just failed. It had opened. Completely. The seal didn't wait for confirmation. He forced the hatch. Once. It resisted. Twice. The frost cracked slightly. A thin line of white light broke through the seal. 3 times. The mechanism gave just enough to create a gap. Cold air rushed in, sharp and violent, carrying snow, wind, and something else. Sound. The storm above. Alive. Uncontrolled. Real. He pushed harder. Muscles tightening. Grip steady. The hatch shifted again, opening wider, enough to climb through, enough to escape, and he didn't hesitate. He pulled himself upward, forcing his body through the opening, leaving behind the collapsing structure, the failing containment, the rising threat that no longer belonged beneath the ground. The storm hit him instantly. Hard. Violent. Blinding. Snow tearing across his face, wind pushing against him with enough force to break balance if he wasn't ready. But he was ready, because this environment, this chaos, this unpredictability, was something he understood, something he could move through, something he could survive. He pulled himself fully out and turned immediately, scanning, adjusting, recalibrating, because outside does not mean safe, it only means different, and different environments carry different threats. And then he saw it. The white German shepherd. Closer now. Much closer than before. Standing just beyond the edge of the structure, body tense, eyes locked on him, not in relief, not in confusion, but in urgency, because the situation had not ended, it had only changed. The connection snapped back into place instantly. No hesitation. No delay. Just understanding. The dog turned. Moved. Not away. But along the edge of the structure. Tracking. Guiding. The seal followed. Because the dog wasn't just leading him away. It was leading him towards something. Or away from something specific. And that distinction mattered. Behind them, the ground trembled. Not violently. But steadily. The snow shifting in patterns that did not match the wind, subtle rises, slight depressions, movement beneath the surface that broke the natural flow of the storm, and that movement spread outward from the facility, not contained anymore, not localized, but expanding. The seal moved faster, matching the dog's pace, trusting the direction. Because the dog had already proven something no one else had believed. And now it was the only thing guiding him through this. They reached a point along the outer edge where the snow had already begun to sink slightly, not collapsing, but weakening, and the dog stopped there, turning back toward him, holding position, not moving forward, not retreating, but marking the location. The seal stepped closer. Carefully. Reading the surface. Feeling the shift beneath his boots. And then it happened. The ground moved. Not collapsing downward, but rising. A slow, unnatural swell beneath the snow, pushing upward from below, displacing layers that should not move like that, and the seal stepped back instantly, pulling away from that point, because instinct doesn't wait for confirmation. The dog moved too. Not in fear, but in precision. Repositioning. Tracking the movement as it shifted again. Because whatever was beneath them had reached the surface. And it wasn't stopping. The snow cracked. A thin line at first. Then wider. Then deeper. And something beneath it moved again. Closer. Stronger. More defined. The storm howled around them, but beneath that chaos, something else was breaking through. Not just the ground, but the boundary between what was hidden and what was now exposed. And for the first time, fully, clearly, undeniably, the seal understood one thing. This wasn't something they had discovered. This was something that had always been there. And now, it was no longer buried. It was rising. The ground did not explode outward the way instinct might expect. It didn't erupt in a violent burst or collapse in a sudden drop. It changed in a way that was far more controlled, far more deliberate, the snow lifting in sections as if something beneath it was testing the surface rather than forcing through it, and that alone made the seal's entire focus tighten into something sharper than urgency. Because controlled movement meant awareness, and awareness meant this was not a blind force. Breaking free, this was something choosing how and where to emerge. He stepped back another pace, boots pressing into unstable snow, adjusting his stance to keep balance against both the wind and the shifting ground, while the white German shepherd mirrored that movement perfectly, never breaking alignment with the disturbance beneath them, its eyes locked, its body low, not in fear, but in readiness, the same readiness it had shown in combat zones. In environments where threat did not always reveal itself immediately but was always present. The crack widened. Not fast, but steadily. A thin line becoming a fracture, the fracture branching slightly, not randomly, but following the pressure from below, tracing a path that seemed almost intentional, and the seal's eyes tracked it, not just watching the surface, but reading the direction, because direction reveals intent, and intent reveals pattern, and pattern gives you the only chance to anticipate what comes next. Behind them, the facility groaned again, louder now, sections of its outer structure beginning to fail under the combined pressure from below and the instability spreading outward, and a portion of the outer wall shifted, not collapsing completely, but tilting just enough to break its alignment, snow sliding down its surface in heavy sheets, and that shift changed everything. Because it meant the structural integrity was no longer holding even at the surface level, and whatever had broken through below was now affecting everything above it. The dog moved first. Not away, but laterally, tracking the spread of the fracture as it extended outward, adjusting position with precise steps, staying parallel to the movement beneath the ground, and the seal followed instantly, not questioning direction, not hesitating, because that movement wasn't random, it was guided by something deeper than sight, something that had already proven itself more reliable than anything else in this situation. Another shift. Stronger. The ground bulged again, this time more pronounced, lifting several inches before settling slightly, not collapsing, but holding that new shape, and beneath that bulge something moved, something large enough to displace that much mass, but controlled enough not to break through immediately, and that balance between force and restraint was what made it dangerous, because uncontrolled force is predictable, it destroys everything in its path. But controlled force adapts, changes, chooses. The seal's breathing slowed again, not from calm, but from focus, because this moment required clarity more than speed, and clarity comes when everything else narrows down to what matters most, the movement, the pattern, the next shift. The dog stopped again. Directly at a new point along the surface. Lowering its head. Not digging this time. Just listening. And then it let out a low sound. Not a growl. Not a bark. But something in between. A warning. The ground beneath that exact point shifted again. Harder. The fracture widened rapidly, splitting open just enough to reveal darkness beneath, not deep, not endless, but close enough to see that whatever was below had reached the final layer, the last barrier between it and the open surface. The seal stepped back another pace, pulling slightly on the dog's collar instinctively, not to restrain it, but to keep it aligned with him, because proximity to that opening was now a risk they couldn't afford, not until they understood what was coming through. Behind them, the facility gave way further, a section of the outer wall collapsing inward this time, not outward, pulling snow and debris down into the space below, and for a brief moment, the inside of the structure was visible through that break, lights flickering, shadows moving, people still inside, still trying to contain something that was no longer containable, and that image locked into his mind instantly. Because it wasn't just a structure failing, it was a system collapsing, and systems like that don't collapse unless the force against them exceeds everything they were designed to withstand. The fracture in the ground spread faster now. Branches extending outward. Snow shifting. Edges crumbling. And then the first part of it gave way completely. Not violently, but definitively. A section of the surface dropped just enough to expose what lay beneath. Not fully. Not clearly. But enough. Something moved in that darkness. Not a shape that could be defined. Not something that could be immediately understood. But movement. Slow. Heavy. Deliberate. The seal didn't look away. Because looking away doesn't make it less real. It only makes you less prepared. The dog stepped slightly forward again, despite the risk, not in defiance, but in instinct, its entire focus locked onto that movement, reading it, tracking it, understanding it in a way that didn't rely on human logic, and that connection between them tightened again, because now they were both aligned on the same point, the same threat, the same reality. Another section of ground shifted. Closer. The fracture expanding in their direction. The seal moved again. Not backward this time, but sideways, pulling the dog with him. Repositioning. Because staying ahead of that spread was the only way to maintain control of distance. The storm continued to rage around them, wind and snow tearing across the surface, but none of that mattered now, because the real movement was beneath their feet, beneath the layers of white that had hidden it for who knows how long. The facility behind them collapsed further. Sections breaking away, falling inward, disappearing into the darkness below. And with each collapse, the movement beneath the ground became stronger, more active, as if the removal of those layers had freed it further, had given it more space to move, more access to the surface. The seal's mind locked onto one clear conclusion. This wasn't a single point of emergence anymore. It was spreading, expanding, breaking through in multiple places at once. And that meant escape wasn't about outrunning one location. It was about staying ahead of something that was growing outward in every direction. The dog suddenly shifted direction again. More sharply this time. Moving faster. Pulling ahead. And the seal followed without hesitation. Because whatever the dog was sensing now was more immediate, more dangerous, more urgent. The ground ahead of them trembled. Not subtly, but clearly. And the snow there began to rise. Faster. Higher. More unstable. And for the first time, the seal felt something different. Not fear. But the realization that distance alone might not be enough. Because whatever was beneath them was no longer just breaking through. It was accelerating. And it was learning the surface just as quickly as they were trying to escape it. And behind them, in the collapsing remains of the facility, something finally broke through completely. Not beneath them, but through the structure itself. And the sound that followed was not mechanical, not structural, but something else entirely. Something alive. Something massive. Something that had been buried long enough to adapt to the dark. And now, it was in the open. The sound that tore through the collapsing remains of the facility did not belong to anything built by human hands. It carried weight, depth, and something older than the structure itself, something that had existed long before steel and reinforced concrete had tried to hold it in place. And as that sound rolled across the snow-covered ground, cutting through the storm with a force that made the air itself feel heavier, the seal didn't turn immediately, not because he didn't want to see, but because he understood something critical in that moment. Seeing it would not change what it was, and reacting too soon could cost him the only advantage he still had, movement. The white German shepherd did not hesitate. It surged forward. Not blindly. Not in panic. But with a precision that came from complete understanding of the threat behind them and the path ahead, its body cutting through the snow with powerful, controlled strides, ears locked forward, eyes focused, and that movement alone confirmed everything the seal needed to know, because the dog wasn't fleeing randomly, it was choosing direction based on something deeper than sight, something that tracked movement beneath the surface. Something that could anticipate where the next break would happen before it occurred. The seal followed. Every step deliberate. Every movement calculated. Snow pushing against his legs, wind tearing across his body, but none of it slowing him, because this was no longer about endurance, it was about alignment, staying in sync with the only guide that understood the terrain as it was now, not as it had been. Behind them, the facility collapsed further. Not in a single fall, but in stages. Sections tearing inward, others breaking outward, the structure folding into itself as the ground beneath it gave way, and through those breaks, through those open wounds in the building, something moved. Not fully visible. Not clearly defined. But unmistakably present. Large enough to displace entire sections of reinforced structure. Controlled enough to move through it without destroying everything at once. The seal felt it more than he saw it. That same pressure in his chest. That same unnatural resonance. Now stronger. Now closer. Now above ground. The dog veered slightly to the right, adjusting, tracking. Because the movement beneath the snow ahead of them had changed direction again, spreading faster, reaching outward in multiple lines, like cracks branching through ice under pressure, and that pattern told him something critical. It wasn't just rising, it was expanding, mapping the surface the same way it had mapped the structure below. The ground ahead shifted. A low tremor at first. Then a visible ripple beneath the snow. The seal adjusted instantly, changing direction with the dog, avoiding that line of movement, because stepping onto it would mean stepping directly into the path of emergence, and that was a risk that could not be taken. Another sound came from behind. Closer this time. He turned. Just enough. Just for a second. And what he saw was not a clear form. Not something that could be described easily. But movement within movement. Layers shifting against each other. Mass displacing snow and debris as it moved forward through the broken remains of the facility, not rushing, not lunging, but advancing with a controlled inevitability that made it far more dangerous than anything chaotic. He turned back forward immediately. Because that was enough. Enough to confirm. Enough to understand. Enough to know that staying ahead was no longer optional. It was survival. The storm intensified again. Wind howling louder. Snow thickening. Visibility dropping even further. But in a strange way, that chaos worked in their favor, because it disrupted clear tracking, blurred outlines, masked movement, and the dog used that, adjusting pace, adjusting direction, staying just ahead of the shifting patterns beneath the surface. The seal followed without hesitation. Trusting completely. Because trust was the only thing left that had not failed. The ground beneath them trembled again. Stronger. Closer. The dog stopped suddenly. Turning sharply. Repositioning. And that abrupt change sent a surge of urgency through him, because sudden changes like that meant immediate threat, not distant, not spreading, but directly beneath or directly ahead. The snow in front of them rose. Not slowly. Not gradually. But quickly. A sharp upward displacement that cracked the surface instantly, splitting it open in a jagged line that stretched across their path, and the seal reacted without thought, pulling back, shifting weight, moving away from that break as the ground beneath it gave way. Something moved through that opening. Closer than before. More defined. Not clear. But closer. The dog growled. Low. Controlled. Focused. Not in fear. But in warning. The seal moved again. Faster now. Not just following. But matching urgency. Because distance was collapsing. The space between them and whatever was moving beneath the surface shrinking with every second. Behind them, the facility was no longer recognizable as a structure. It had collapsed into itself almost completely, sections disappearing beneath the ground, others broken apart, scattered across the surface, and through what remained, that movement continued, pushing forward, not contained by walls anymore, not limited by structure, but free. The dog changed direction again, leading them toward higher ground. A slight elevation in the terrain. Barely visible through the storm. But enough. Because elevation meant stability. Even if only temporary. They reached it. Climbing through deep snow. Boots slipping slightly. Muscles straining. But momentum carrying them upward. The seal pulled himself onto the ridge. Turning immediately. Scanning. And for the first time, from that higher point he saw more. Not everything. But enough. The surface below wasn't just shifting in one place. It was marked by multiple disturbances. Multiple lines. Multiple points where the snow had lifted, cracked, or collapsed. And at the center of it all, movement. Large. Slow. Advancing. Not toward a single direction. But outward. Expanding. The realization hit hard and clear. This wasn't pursuit. It wasn't chasing them specifically. It was spreading. Learning the surface. Mapping it. Adapting to it. The dog stood beside him. Still. Watching. Tracking. Its focus locked on the movement below. and then it turned its head toward him. Just slightly. Just enough. And in that moment, something shifted. Not in the environment. Not in the threat. But in him. Because everything that had happened up to this point, the warnings, the disbelief, the isolation, the attempt to silence him, all of it had led here. To this moment. Where the truth was no longer hidden. No longer buried. No longer contained. And he understood something with absolute certainty. This was not something that could be stopped here. Not by him. Not by anyone. But it could be understood. Tracked. Survived. And that was where his role changed. Not as someone trying to prove a warning, but as someone who had already seen what others refused to see. Someone who had already adapted once. And would adapt again. The storm howled across the ridge. Snow moving in waves. The ground below continuing to shift. And the white German shepherd stepped forward again. Not away from the movement, but along its edge. Tracking it. Guiding him. As it always had. The seal took one last look at the collapsing remains behind them. Then turned forward. And followed. Because the story didn't end here. It had only just begun.